Hello and welcome to another video from Combat Fusion Martial Arts. My name's Andy Seetherton and today we're going to be looking at crashing wings. Now before we get into the video, I'd like to apologise for this one taking a little bit longer to get out than normal. I've had a few things on and it's taken me away from recording. Now we'll be looking at the technique from 4 different aspects without a partner today, just to get an all-round view of every move within the technique. It's not an overly sophisticated technique, but I do want you to understand the principles and ideas we're presenting in this video. So we're going to have a look at it without a partner, then break it down as usual on a move by move basis. And then in the second part of the video, we'll delve deeper into some of the variations and options that can present themselves when working with crashing wings. So let's get into crashing wings. The basic attack for crashing wings is an underarm bear hug from the rear. The height of this attack is paramount in the ideal phase to enable the full effect to be felt by the defender and the attacker. The attack should be executed at a height lower than the center of gravity of the defender. This is to enable the destabilization of the defender's structure and for the potential of lifting and dumping the defender to the floor. An error often made in the ideal phase of crashing wings is to attack at a higher level. This nullifies the effect of the initial twin elbow strikes to the attacker's arms. However, this situation is explored in the technique spiraling twig. When all is correct in the ideal phase, the defender's elbows strike diagonally downwards onto the attacker's arms, causing trauma to the extensor carpi radialis longus. These twin elbow strikes give the technique its name. The elbows, or wings, crash down upon their targets. Another consideration we should explore is why this attack is in fact an underarm bear hug. If we stand with our arms down, it is very unlikely our attacker will slide their arms underneath ours to apply this hug. In this position, we are much more likely to encounter an overarm bear hug, as this will facilitate greater control. Therefore, our arms would most likely be away from our body, leaving the trunk the most accessible target available. This is why we initially train this technique from a high arm point of origin. Even with your hands on your hips, it is still unlikely to expect an underarm bear hug. As this too offers less control, it is still more likely to find your arms collapsed by an overarm grab. Combined with the crashing wings, we step out to the side into a horse stance, employing marriage of gravity, the anchor principle, and fully focused movement. This is intended to release, if not weaken, your opponent's grip around your waist, enough to allow you to move through a 45-degree cat stance into a reverse bow to your opponent's rear. On planting into the reverse bow, ensure your leading leg is in contact with the rear of your opponent's leg. This will also facilitate the option to execute a buckle if needed. Avoid planting into your reverse bow with a gap between your leg and your opponent's leg, as this may result in your opponent executing a counterattack. Now pivot from your reverse bow into a neutral bow, delivering an outward elbow to your opponent's face as you simultaneously cock your free hand above your shoulder. Immediately continue by pivoting into a forward bow as you deliver an inward downward hammer fist to his bladder. As you pivot into this hammer fist, your outside arm travels to pin your opponent's grabbing arm to your hip, clawing across his face in the process. This will also facilitate a potential arm break as your opponent falls from the stance rotation and strike combinations. If you are not carrying on to the extension, front crossover and cover out. We will now proceed on to the extension to crashing wings. If you do not require this knowledge at your stage of training, you may wish to bypass the next section of this video. Have your hammer fist now travel up your opponent's body to heel palm his chin and immediately convert into a claw to his face as your free hand assists by gripping at his forehead. As you grasp your opponent's head, have your lead foot move out into a wide neutral bow. Bring your opponent's posture to a backward leaning position and immediately follow up with a step through knee to the rear of his head or neck. The impact should come as he falls backwards. After the impact of the knee, continue the movement of the leg forward, planting to the floor into a neutral bow, all the time still controlling your opponent's head. As your opponent falls, take a step to your rear, dropping into a wide kneel stance as you slam his head into the floor, clawing across his face as you relinquish control of his head. Follow up with a roundhouse slicing kick to your opponent's face, which continues to follow its circular path, planting to enable the delivery of a sliding back heel kick to his head. From here, front crossover and cover out. Now, before we get into the next part of this video, I'd like to remind you that if you haven't done so already and you find the information in these videos of use, please think of subscribing to our channel. Also, don't forget to give the video a like and give it a share out to your fellow Kenpoists or other martial artists you think may find the information of use or of interest. Now, we're going to take a look at some of the different variations and options that can present themselves with this technique, crashing wings. This will involve our opponent manipulating our body around. It's very unlikely our opponent is just going to grab us and hold us static. There is a big chance that we're going to be pushed forward, pulled back, or even lifted up. And we will have a look at these options and how our environment can also play a part in our defense. We'll discuss the relationship between a full Nelson and an underarm bear hug. And we will also have a look at how our modern environment may affect the effectiveness of our counterattacks. So let's get in and have a look at these variations. Let's take a deeper look now at crashing wings. Now, we already know the reason why you see me starting with my hands out to the front like this. And we also know that when we bring our arms down, we're crashing down onto the target. But we're using, obviously, marriage of gravity by stepping out to the side onto a horse stance. This time, when you step out, when we're looking at 12 o'clock and we are stepping out to 3 o'clock into our horse stance, okay, like this, what I want you to do is I want you to step back on a slight angle. So instead of stepping to 3, we're actually going to be stepping back more to 4. What I'm trying to achieve with this angular step is to feel, rather than need to change my posture by looking to see where my opponent's leg is. In this case, we're talking about his right leg. I want his right thigh to be against my left butt cheek. So as I step back at an angle, I feel his leg against my butt cheek. I know that there's a greater chance of ease for me to step around and continue with the base model technique. If for some reason I don't step out far enough, or as I step my opponent moves with me, and I feel this time his thigh here against my coccyx, or even against my right butt cheek, I know I'm going to have a greater difficulty in getting around that leg. So this may indicate to me that I have to change tack. In that case, I might go into squatting sacrifice and bring the leg up between my legs. If you know that technique, you'll understand the concept involved in that. If you're not sure of the technique, have a word with your instructor and get them to show you the concept, even if it's not on your belt level. Another aspect we're going to need to look at with crashing wings is that when our opponent attacks, it's unlikely he's going to want to keep us in a certain static position. Now, he may wish to pull us backwards towards him. So as we're grabbed and pulled, we have to make a step to absorb that pull. And as you can see, if my hands are up and as my opponent grabs me, he pulls me backwards, I'm stepping exactly the same way as I was when I talked about changing the step from 3 o'clock back to slightly to 4 o'clock. So what we talked about previously can be applied now to when our opponent starts to move us around with his grab. So if he pulls us backwards, we automatically have to step back to absorb that grab, and that allows us, if his leg's in the right position, the advantage of being able to step easily around to continue with the base model. Now, if my opponent can pull me backwards, he can obviously push me forwards. So my hands up, if he grabs me around the waist and uses forward momentum in his grab, I'm going to need to absorb that forward momentum by stepping forward. So as I'm grabbed and pushed forward, I step with my, this time, left leg, which will put me in the same position as if I was pulled backwards or stepped deliberately back on an angle. The difference being is my position related to my opponent. He's going to be in a position which makes doing the base model on the standard side or the strong side impractical. So I have to now use my ambidexterity and switch to this weak side of crashing wings and move around his left leg. So we talked about being held statically and stepping back on a slight angle. We've talked about being pulled backwards and using that same angle to facilitate the technique. We've also talked about being pushed forward and having to use the opposite side to get to the same position on the base model. So another aspect we need to think about when we're talking about the step to the side is the alignment of my spine or my center line with my opponent's center line. If the center lines are kept together in line, this makes it a lot easier for my opponent to pick me up, even if my body's relaxed, because as you know, a relaxed body is harder to manipulate than a rigid body. But if our spines or center lines are lined up, this makes it easier for my opponent to lift me up. So another aspect of the step to the side, whether it's to 3 o'clock in base or slightly backwards to 4 o'clock, and misalign the spines and use marriage of gravity and relax, this makes it much harder for my opponent to be able to manipulate me and maneuver me into a position which is advantageous to him. So what happens now if we're lifted off the ground? So if we're lifted off the ground, we would have either one foot or both feet off the floor. Now that could be that there's another opponent in front of us, and there we could apply the technique such as bearing the ram, or we may be faced against an obstacle like a wall or a bar, where we can use that to maybe push back against our opponent before stepping down and completing the technique. Those are the things we should think about when referring to the variations we can apply to crashing wings. Now, talking about being lifted up, we saw in the video that it may be possible for our opponent to lift us up and dump us on the floor in some manner. It's useful to be able to know how to roll if you are dumped onto the floor head first. And one way to practice that is to use a wall and a handstand. Just walk your feet up the wall to a handstand as vertical or near vertical as you can be, and then learn to drop down and roll from that vertical position up to a standing position. Now in the video we talked about the position of the hands and how our opponent is likely to grab us. The reason this is an underarm grab is because our arms are most probably going to be up. If our arms were down or on our hips, there is a potential that the person who's likely to grab us overarm to try to control it. With our hands on our hips or our hands away from our body, our opponent may not be using a bear hug as his initial attack. He may be attempting to place us into a full Nelson. Now, the difference between a full Nelson and a bear hug are related to the same thing as a handshake and a wrist grab. Remember, all a wrist grab is an overshot handshake. So all a full Nelson is a bear hug in waiting. If my opponent tries to put a full Nelson on me and I defend against it, if I break that full Nelson, the potential is he's not going to just allow his hands to stay there, he's going to convert that movement into a bear hug which is underarm. So I would have to then apply the technique crashing wings, or if it's a high grab, I might be using the technique spiraling twig. These are all aspects we need to look at when considering the variations that we can apply to techniques such as crashing wings. Now then, with everything we've talked about on this video, from the opening section when we analysed the technique to the second part when we looked at options and variations, one of the things you should take away from this video is not to rely on the crashing wings to actually do their job. We have to take into consideration environment, and that consists of everything that's on us, in us, and around us. And that applies to us and also to our opponent. If our opponent was to attack us, say with a heavy, thick leather jacket on, then the actual impact value of the crashing wings would be nullified. Also, if we talk about what's in us and in our opponent, they may have a very high pain threshold and be able to take a lot of pounding even to sensitive areas of their body. So going forward, I want you to take that into consideration, not only with crashing wings, but with all the techniques you practice. Well, thank you once again for joining us here at Combat Fusion Martial Arts on one of our InfoPod videos. I hope you're going to find the information useful in your training. Don't forget, if you have any comments, questions or requests, put them in the comments section. We do read them all and we do try to respond to as many as we can. So, this is Andy Seelan of Combat Fusion Martial Arts, saying goodbye.